Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
And now to the papers, and a word of warning first of all. We are going to concentrate on the very important British politics, to the exclusion of almost all other stories. So if you're interested in the rest, don't be tight. Get out there and buy a newspaper for yourself. And here's some headlines. If Theresa May picked up the Sunday Telegraph first of all, there she is, May's fees revolution to win over students, or indeed the Sunday Express. That's more like it, Mrs May. She might ask herself, what's all the trouble about? What's all this nonsense? Andrew Marr is getting overexcited, as usual. And then she picks up the Sunday Times. Queen misled by broken May. And a story saying Boris Johnson believes she will be gone in a year. And there's the Mail on Sunday, normally fairly supportive. PM gambles on tuition fees, U-turn to head off Tory coup. Very exciting. And finally, she probably doesn't read the Observer very closely, but nonetheless, there we are. May in battle for survival as Tories sharpen knives. Now, is this all nonsense and gossip, or is it real? I'm joined by Ian Dale and Polly Toynbee to go into this. Ian, let's start off with Theresa May's own words and her interview in the Sunday Telegraph.
Well, this is a double-page spread here, looking very confident, but the headline here, I'm not ceding any ground to Jeremy Corbyn, I will fight the next election. And that's going to be one of the main issues at this party conference, I think, among MPs, those that bother to attend it, and also party workers, where they think, well, is Theresa May going to fight the next election? She's absolutely determined to, it seems.
And yet she said immediately after that election, when she talked to the 1922 committee, who were feeling very bruised, that her future was in their hands. And in a sense, it's in the hands of the Tory party. So it's not up to her whether she fights the election, it's up to the Tory party.
It's also up to the Brexit negotiations. I mean, if the Brexit negotiations go well, I mean, they I think, are back on, shall we say, a bit of an even keel now after a very dodgy start, then she can say, well, look, David Davis and I did this. I want to fight the next election. I have a right to fight the next election. She would have every right to say that. But there's one thing I want to pick out of this interview where she resurrects the possibility of no deal, which is something that a lot of the media think that she put to bed a few weeks ago, and certainly in the Florence speech. And I think the European Commission will look at this, because she says we are making preparations for all eventualities, and that includes for no deal. Now, that's absolutely what they should be doing, because I think if you look at the way things are going, yes, there are more positive signs at the moment, but there is a possibility that we will have to walk out at some point.
And we need to know what that means, and that's something we need to talk to her about later on. Polly, you've got Bojo, Boris Johnson, in the, is it the Sunday Telegraph?
Yes, it's Boris Johnson's big night. He's going to have a big documentary, Channel 4 documentary about him, in which he's going to say he gets one last shot at the leadership, because otherwise it'll be the next generation. But really the story of all of the papers today is of a party in civil war of a kind we've, I don't think, ever seen before.
These are the Tory party. You've seen it many times before.
Well, it's much more, you know too, it's much more serious than it's ever been before, and quite remarkable, because Theresa May stays there because any alternative leader will make it even worse. And this is civil war that's not going to go away. There isn't going to be an election in a hurry. They've got 4.5 more years, and neither side will give way as to who else might be leader.
And Brexit is the thing that can drive them all completely bonkers. But nonetheless, she's come up with this big tuition fees story this morning. She's got two stories on tuition fees, or two changes in policy, tuition fees and help for young home buyers, both out this morning, both targeted at the very group of young voters who went over to Labour in the election. And Ian, this is, it's described as a U-turn on the front page of I think the Daily Mail, Sunday Mail. It's
not a U-turn, because what they're planning to do is freeze the 9,250, which doesn't sound a very exciting new policy, but they're going to raise the threshold from which you have to start repaying from 21 to 25,000, which I think is quite significant.
But they're also going to review the policy itself. So this leads the possibility, I guess, of some kind of completely different tuition and university funding policy we don't know about.
But what they're offering today is absolutely pathetic. I mean, we know that tuition fees is toxic. It killed Nick Clegg's career, destroyed the Lib Dems. Labour, the moment Labour announced its manifesto of doing away with tuition fees, they soared. I think that this is going to get her nowhere at all. These are minute offers. Also, a very small offer on help to buy.
At least it's a realistic offer, though. You look at what Jeremy Corbyn said at the end of the election campaign, where he raised the possibility of writing off student debt, and a lot of students or ex-students voted for him on that.
Well,
and clearly they're not going to do that because it wasn't costed at all.
Well, Labour will have its problems about costings, but for the time being, Labour is making all of the running, particularly on student fees, but also on housing and other things for the young.
Let's move to Dan Hodges' column in the Mail on Sunday, Ian.
Well, this headline, slap it, all those panicking Tories are right. The PM does need to do something drastic. She needs to give her whole petrified party a slap in the face. Well, she needs to give a few of her cabinet a slap in the face, it has to be said. Well, on the eve of the party conference, you had Sam Coates yesterday tweeting a quote from an anonymous minister. Of course, they're always anonymous because they're so courageous, these people. This minister said to the deputy political editor of The Times, either Boris Johnson goes or she does. What a self-indulgent thing to say the day before your party conference starts. It really gets it off on a good note. And she's got to address this. I interviewed her in July and she said to me, looked me in the eyes and said, no minister is unsackable, no matter how senior they are.
Well, and she's got to sack him.
She's getting to a point where she may have to prove that.
She will have to. Every time she comes to an agreement with him, within 12 hours, he has leapt. He's now produced his own 4 red lines. And Sajid Javid is at the same game. He, interviewed in the Observer, refused to back her, walked out and said, end of interview. Refused to say.
We've run out of time. I think we've run out of time, he said.
To support his own Prime Minister.
He could have found 10 seconds to say, yes, of course she's going to fight the next election, but he didn't. So a bit of bad blood there. So lots and lots to talk about here.
We must
also talk about universal credit at some point.
Yes, I mean, this is a really serious rebellion because 12 Tory MPs have written about the disaster of universal credit, which is unfolding now. And increasingly, lots of Tory MPs are hearing it in their own surgery. As people get moved from tax credit to universal credit, they are losing huge sums of money. These are hard-working families, losing up to £2,800. You've got Dame Louise Casey, an advisor, saying people are going to be destitute.
What we should explain to people watching is that universal credit's been piloted in different parts of the country, and over the next few weeks and into October, it's rolled out for many, many more people. So this is a decisive moment. And the problem, I think, is that for a lot of people, they don't get any money at all for 6 weeks.
Well, the problem
basically,
is that
how are they going to eat this?
The payments are being delayed. I did an hour-long phone-in on this on my show on Friday. I had 3 people in tears. And they were not people you could describe as benefit scroungers. These were genuine people, genuinely destitute. And I then had hundreds of people ring in saying, how can I help these people that we've heard from? And there is clearly a problem in the rollout of this. Everyone agrees that universal credit in principle is a good idea. The Labour Party agree that, the Liberal Democrats agree that. But the implementation so far has not gone well. So the argument is, well, if you're rolling it out to another 50 areas, shouldn't you put a pause on that until you've sorted out the computer systems, all the other systems that,
it's not
that don't...
computer systems.
Well, it is partly that.
It is partly, but it's much more serious. George Osborne took a large slab of money out of it. It made Ian Duncan Smith very angry, which defeated the whole point of making it always worth your while working. He took a lot of money out. We have to remember 14 billion have been taken out of benefits, and a lot of it away from these hard-working families on the edge. They're just about managing. And if Theresa May makes another speech saying she's on the side of the just about managing, they've done worse in the last year since she made that speech last time.
So the other real question here, which I don't think we've quite nailed yet, is there a serious move against Theresa May at this party conference?
I don't think there is. I've spoken to very few Tory MPs who want a leadership change because there is no obvious successor. Theresa May's most powerful thing, if you like, is that there is no obvious successor to her.
Not Boris Johnson?
Well, Boris Johnson clearly seems to be pitching himself. I mean, who in their right minds would cooperate with a Channel 4 documentary on the first day of a party conference? I mean, who would do that unless there was another agenda? But if you look,
he want to be sacked?
Well, it's a very odd thing for a foreign secretary. I mean, Michael Heseltine did that in 1986 and sort of tried to provoke his sacking, and in the end he had to walk out.
It's going quite well for him. When you ask Tory party members, he was down. He's now become very, very popular again. There are a lot of people who think he is our defender when it comes to Brexit. He's the real deal.
But look at the leadership election system. You have to get through Tory MPs first. And his 4,000-word article, yes, it had a few fans in Parliament, but virtually all the MPs I've talked to say, well, how self-indulgent was that? It clearly wasn't authorised by Number 10 because they didn't want him to make the speech.
One final word, or 3 words, Jacob Rees-Mogg. He's in the Mail on Sunday. He's the dark horse.
Mogmentum is still with us.
There is a story, I think in the Mail on Sunday, suggesting that the Tories are going to get their version of Momentum, a new organisation. I can't remember what it's called, but it's been called Mogmentum.
It hasn't done very well so far.
I think that the Labour Party would be whooping with delight, laughter and a surefire winner for them.
It's not going to happen because Jacob Rees-Mogg wants to be Speaker of the House of Commons. He knows that he's not going to be leader of the Conservative Party. I think he quite liked the publicity he got, but that's as far as it will go.
OK, well, thank you both very much indeed. Fascinating stuff.
Well, let's take a look at what's on the front pages this morning. Shall we start with the Mail on Sunday? It chooses to lead on Theresa May's plans to freeze tuition fees and says the Prime Minister hopes her plans will head off any challenges to her leadership. The Sunday Telegraph calls it a fee revolution. It says the PM is hoping to win over young voters with the overhaul. Turning to the Sunday Express, it supports the Prime Minister and welcomes the new policy pledges, seeing them as Mrs May taking charge. Turn to the Observer, however, and it suggests that she's in trouble after her Community Secretary, Sajid Javid, refused to back her to lead the Tories into the next election. Interestingly enough, we'll be speaking to Mr Javid just a little later in the programme. Here's the Sunday Times. It says the Prime Minister infuriated Buckingham Palace after the general election by breaching protocol and failing to keep them up to date with her attempts to form a government. Huffington Post UK is currently leading on the election of new UKIP leader Henry Bolton, who told his party conference yesterday that British culture is being buried. And BuzzFeed reports on a protest held in London yesterday against Ireland's strict abortion laws. A referendum will be held in Ireland on the issue next year. Well, to talk about all of that, we're joined by the Deputy Political Editor of the Huffington Post, Owen Bennett, Executive Editor of Conservative Hole, Mark Wallace, and Senior Political Correspondent at The Times, Lucy Fisher. Very good morning to all of you. Let's dive straight on in, shall we? Owen, your choice from the Sunday Telegraph, the fee revolution, as they call it. Do you see it as such?
Well, I don't want to sound like the comic book guy from The Simpsons, but worst revolution ever. I mean, if there's anything you've learned, or you think Theresa May would have learned from the elections, you need to be bold in these things and just really not increasing the amount of tuition fees above 9,250.
Yeah, but let's be absolutely clear. What is this a policy? Or is this just not going forward with the policy which they announced earlier on this year?
Not going forward with the policy they announced earlier this year. I mean, they will point to the fact that they're lifting the rate at which point you start paying back money if you're a graduate. But that works out, I think, £360 a year. It's an extra £30 a month. I mean, that's not, the cost of living as it is, that's not going to make a huge difference to students' lives, is it? This is trying to engage Jeremy Corbyn on his turf with young people, and it's just completely failing to do anything bold. And all it does really is highlight the fact that students are paying over £9,000 a year for tuition.
I broadly agree that the freeze on the overall level of fees probably does just highlight quite how high they are for an awful lot of students and graduates and people thinking of going to university. I do think that 360 quid more a year in someone's pocket is helpful.
And it's cumulative, year on year on year. I mean, after a few years, you're going to have a few quid in your bank account.
It would definitely be a mistake to describe this as a revolution. So, certainly the kind of Jeremy Corbyn standard of, or John McDonnell standard of what a revolution involves. But I do think it's broadly helpful. What it also underpins, of course, is this is a government that a lot of people want quite drastic action from it, but it doesn't have a huge number of votes in the House of Commons. It doesn't have a huge amount of money.
I mean, that's the problem with it, isn't it, Lucy? That when you're confronted with a populist policy such as scrapping tuition fees and taking action on student debt, this looks pretty piecemeal.
I think that's absolutely right, and that will be a major criticism I'm sure we're likely to hear, at least in the corridors, if not more publicly today, that this is really Labour light. And last week the Conservatives unveiled a new poster that sort of said Labour always take it too far, with £316 billion slogan disappearing into a black hole. Well, saying that Labour always take it too far suggests that they're going some direction along the right principles. So I think it's a very difficult argument for the Conservatives to keep making, that we need a balanced approach of fiscal responsibility with some more public investment, when Labour just want to give a lot more away.
I mean, fundamentally, the Conservatives have a real problem when it comes to attracting younger voters. I mean, they've always had a bit of an issue with it, but since the advent of Corbyn and Corbynism, I mean, it's getting pretty disastrous at that end of the kind of the age spectrum, isn't it?
Well, the flip point now, when you're more likely to go from voting Labour to Conservative, is now the age 47. Before the election began, it was 34. So that just shows how disastrous the election campaign was. Now, I think the Tories don't need to focus too much on the under 25 voters. It's a 25 to 45 bracket. It's a young professional bracket. I think they really need to be focusing on. That's the kind of the low-hanging fruit. Just very quickly on the tuition fees, one of the things she mentions in a review is bringing back the maintenance grant. Now, a lot of the students that I speak to say that is one of the big things that makes a huge difference whether people can go to uni, is this maintenance grant being abolished. I think if they brought that back, there would be a way of saying, look, we're not completely going into Corbyn's territory on getting rid of tuition fees, but here is a policy that we would bring forward which would help those from less well-off backgrounds get into university.
Still sticking with the theme of kind of attracting younger viewers, Mark, I mean, the story you've flagging up on the front of the Sun, Help to Buy. I mean, it's a real problem at the moment. I mean, the age bracket you were talking about just there, I mean, people are spending, on average, a third of their take-home pay on rent at the moment. Getting onto the property ladder seems impossible. I mean, what does this Help to Buy scheme actually do to improve the situation?
Well, here's a mismatch between a problem and a purported solution. As Owen says, it's undoubtedly the case. The Conservative Party got really badly hammered, not just among under 25s, but among people between 25 and 40, where they're having kids, trying to settle down, hoping to get a home of their own. Now, I can understand why, given the years of George Osborne's Help to Buy programmes, this seems like a natural thing to the Conservative leadership to do. But you've got to ask, with a limited supply of housing, what is the effect going to be of pouring in more money to demand? And that's just going to be to push up prices. And that, I think, is a serious concern.
Lucy, I mean, successive kind of Conservative leaders have tried to tackle the housing problem. 130,000, I think, have already been assisted with the Help to Buy scheme. I mean, I'm sure that they would say this is fantastic. But unless we're talking about a home building programme on a massive scale, I mean, how do we get ourselves out of this hole?
I think it's very difficult. I mean, Sajid Javid has pledged to build 266,000 homes a year. I mean, I don't think anyone really believes that that is possible. And that's the sort of minimum supply needed to keep up with ever-growing demand. Again, it comes back to this core sort of Conservative principles. If a property-owning democracy is key to the Conservative ideology, and without being able to build enough for people to own their own properties, I think again Jeremy Corbyn's offering looks a lot more attractive. Yeah,
but when you've seen house prices rise by what, 32%, over since 2010, you've seen wages go up 3%. I mean, you don't need to be a macroeconomic expert to work out that we're approaching a tipping point. And does this look to you, Owen, anything other than tinkering with policies that have already been announced?
I think it's going to make it worse. I think if you've got £10 billion to spend it and you want to tackle the housing problem, then build houses with it. Use that £10 billion to build some houses, build some social housing, build some houses that are good for people to rent, good for people to buy. If you've got this money, if you've given the magic money tree a shake and you found £10 billion fall from it, then use it in that way. I think just using this, all it's going to do is just drive up prices in the housing market, and it's not actually going to solve the problem at all.
Let's move on then to your story, Lucy, and this is on the front of the Sunday Times. The idea that Theresa May will be gone in a year. Who came up with that one?
Boris Johnson, reportedly.
That's amazing, man. It's amazing.
Great surprise, I'm sure. Yeah, it's interesting here. Boris said to be believing that the PM won't last 12 months, said to be wanting this final tilt at the leadership himself. It's interesting that there's a lot of rumours about what Boris is saying on background to his friends and allies, contrasts with his sort of more public statements of loyalty to the Prime Minister. But it's interesting, in recent days we've seen only one really loyal outrider for her, Damien Green, sort of agreeing with her sort of proposition that she'll lead the party into the 2022 election. Today, Sajid Javid dodging the question, all this talk of Boris having a leadership...
Philip Hammond also has avoided the question
Philip Hammond
as well.
also avoiding the question, exactly. Now Boris, again, talk of him presenting a challenge. I think it's going to be a really, really make-or-break conference for Theresa May.
I mean, does anyone sitting here think that Theresa May will be leader of the Conservative Party at the time of the next general election, if we assume that the general election is not going to happen in the next 12-24 months?
No.
Unlikely.
You never know what's going to happen in British politics, but I think it's extremely unlikely. I don't hear a huge amount of demand for it. We'll be publishing very shortly on Conservative Home, our latest monthly survey asking when people in the party want it to go, and it's not looking great.
But there's a huge amount of frothing, wailing, gnashing of teeth any time that Boris Johnson comes forward with stuff like this. But given just how precarious Theresa May's position is, isn't it right for someone who wants clearly to be the next leader of the Conservative Party, the next Prime Minister, to set out his stall, to let us know what he wants to do?
I think the problem that Boris has got is that he's popular amongst the activists, and the surveys on your website show that he is popular as the next leader. But in order to get to the members to be the leader, he has to convince enough MPs to back him. And there's quite a few MPs who don't like the fact that he keeps rocking the boat, who don't like the fact that actually by behaving like this, it does make an early election more likely and therefore more chance of Jeremy Corbyn coming in. So he's got a balancing out there, isn't he?
About 80% of Conservative Party members agreed with his Telegraph article very strongly. But the big test is, of course, as you say, MPs have a long history. Ken Clarke, Michael Portillo, of keeping these people off the ballot or trying to stop them getting to members in the first place.
I mean, you mentioned Michael Heseltine there. We spoke to him earlier in the programme, and compare and contrast the reaction to the Boris Johnson interview with The Sun to the intervention made by Ruth Davidson in the Times just before the weekend. I mean, why does she, Lucy, get a rather easier ride when it comes to in essence, stapling her leadership credentials to the mast as well?
Well, I'm not quite sure she did that. She said she very much supports the Prime Minister at present.
I don't think you'll find anyone who says that they don't very much support. It's what they say in private that's the issue.
That's true. At the same time, I think that Boris here, he's gone so much further than the PM's Florence speech last week, setting out these 4 red lines on Brexit. I think his allies would argue, well, the PM's left a vacuum there. She's not setting out her own vision. There isn't certainty. He led he was a key campaigner in the Brexit campaign, so he really has this right to sort of set out a vision, his vision for Brexit, given that he sold it to the country. I think Ruth Davidson isn't going as far in trying to set out her vision for the UK. She's talked repeatedly about her plan to try and get to Bute House and her kind of loyalty to Scottish politics for the moment. So I think there's a disparity in terms of the ambitions of both those two characters.
And it'll be interesting to see, she's speaking this afternoon, just how well it goes down at conference. Well, thank you very much for joining us, Lucy, Mark, Owen. Always lovely to see you.